Welcome to the Warframe broadcast. I'm your host today, Semtexagon, a bloke who loves Warframe way too much. And with that said, we're going to talk about the story in Warframe. Now brace yourself for an emotional roller coaster. And again, we're talking about the story in Warframe, not the lore. You have to understand that I'm pretty obtuse. If it's not right in front of me, the information doesn't exist. Also, I'd love to give you an immaculate vocal performance, but unfortunately I'm sick again, so my body was like, nope. Also, if you haven't noticed, I'm here all by myself. So if you want to join me for future broadcasts, let me know in the comments below, but you do need a decent microphone. Okay, let's get right into it. First up, let's be clear. I'm not going to cover every single last quest. I know, so sad. You were all dying to hear me talk about Sire's Vigil, Howl of the Kubro, and classics like Wave Rider. Now, I don't want to leave you with nothing, so I'll just say that they range from bearable to miserable. None of the side quests are good, and Jorda's precept makes me wanna die. It's always, go here, scan that, kill that, do a 10-minute survival, now do a spy mission. It's just dead time. You know, in general, the story is not really good. I'd be willing to say that even the main story is rather boring and forgetful for the first couple of hundreds of hours of playing the game, which is kind of what you would expect from a free-to-play title like this. And if it was slightly below medicore through and through, I would not be bothered to talk about it. But you see, without warning, a mountain is erected out of hell, reaching into the star of tension, effective dialogue, truly gut-punching moments of emotion and thematic cohesion. And then it takes a fucking swan dive back into the pits of Tartarus. Anyways, the main story consists of Awakening, Vor's Prize, Natan, The Second Dream, The War Within, Chains of Harrow, Apostasy Prologue, The Sacrifice, Prelude to War, and The New War. Out of those 10 quests, 2 of them is introductionary and only serves to introduce the Lotus. Otherwise, the story is self-contained. Once you kill Vor, you're pretty much back to square zero. From a narrative perspective, only of course. Then another 2 of those are actually just the cinematic introduction to the quest that precedes them. That leaves us with 4 main quests that moves the plot along, because Natan and Chains of Harrow actually does very little to progress the main conflict. But anyways, the 4 quests that does progress the main conflict is The Second Dream, The War Within, The Sacrifice, and The New War. Starting at the beginning, The Second Dream. And yes, I know that there are quests that vaguely relate to the main story before this, but this is the first quest where something actually happens. This is where we are introduced to the main conflict between the Tenno and the Sentient. It is also our proper introduction to Shadow and Hunhow. Shadow walks into a circle of battle sentient and tosses a severed Warframe head on the ground, demonstrating not only that Warframes can be killed, but that Shadow is very capable of doing so. Hunhow is this giant creature with red glowing eyes out in the open ocean of Uranus. Between the 2 of them, they carry a sense of tangible danger. Even the Lotus seemed worried because he sends us out to find a piece of Hunhow so that she may interface with him and make sure he doesn't know her secret. But upon touching the fragment of Hunhow, he immediately takes the opportunity to transfer through the Warframe to the Lotus and steal the secret she meant to protect, and thusly resulting in the Lotus causing her worst nightmare by attempting to prevent it from happening. It turns out that the Lotus is apparently much stronger than she has been letting on, because she pulled the entire moon into the void. Now, whether this is the doing of her sentient queen powers, or if this is all the doing of the contraption on the moon, it's not exactly clear. Regardless, the sentient are unable to enter the void lest they want to wither away, hence why Hunhow needs Shadow to enter the void for him. This now turns into a desperate race, where we, the Warframes, are trying to stop Shadow from collapsing the pocket within the void which contains the moon. In spite of our best efforts, it's ultimately in vain, but at the precipice of complete defeat and thusly the end of the Warframes, we pull the moon back out of the void as it collapses. Also, can I just add that it's kind of ridiculous that all it takes to pull the entire moon out of the void is shattering 4 fluorescent light tubes? I mean, so what if you ever blow a light bulb, the entire moon just right back into existence? This seems horribly unstable. I understand why they did this for gameplay reasons, but it just puts a big dumb smile on my face thinking about it. But back to the story. The moon is now back in the solar system, meaning that the sentient now can attack the moon and everything on it. The Lotus urgently sends us down on Lua, where we discover a very large capsule hidden on Lua's surface. A child, covered from head to toe in a black suit, drops out onto the floor, and then the Warframe collapses as well, like a wet towel. We now waken as the child, and it turns out Warframes are just remote-controlled suits of armor. When this first happened, it was kind of crazy. In this one moment, our understanding of the world is shattered, and we need to completely reconstruct our understanding of Warframe. But we don't have time for that right now because the sentients are here. Using our Warframe by touching it directly, we are able to use it to carry us to the orbiter while fighting through the sentience with our void magic. But unfortunately, Shadow has also, somehow, made it onto the orbiter. He pierces our Warframe with Hunhao. Yeah, I forgot to mention that Hunhao can transfer his conscience through a sword, which Shadow has. Shadow continues to ward the helpless Tenno, but suddenly the Warframe grabs Hunhao and pulls the upper half of the blade up through the Warframe itself, cutting off Hunhao's connection and disbanding Shadow. Then the Lotus shows up, somehow, and carries us to the somatic chamber. We remember some stuff about the ceremony, and then the credits roll. Honestly, the story is pretty simple, everything considered, but that's not a bad thing. It still manages to be engaging while also establishing the main conflict. The whole concept of Tenno is introduced, which would alter the universe of Warframe forever. Now, you might have noticed that I've been recapping the story so far, and that's because it's the best way to remind you just how simple and cohesive the story used to be. And this quest is not perfect. Again, how does Hunhao just magically appear on the orbiter? But all in all, I think it's a fantastic quest. Now moving on to the War Within. And it turns out that DE was just getting warmed up, because I'm just gonna go ahead and spoil it. The War Within is amazing, but if you're listening to this transmission, then you probably already knew that. The quest starts rather unremarkably, but I do believe this is done on purpose. It feels like another generic mission where you have to chase Teshin around, basically just performing 3 capture missions, but then all of a sudden you stumble upon the Kuva Fortress, the secret main base of the Grineer. The Lotus wants us to retreat and form a plan of attack, but we decide to ignore her advice and proceed lest the Kuva Fortress might move again before we are ready. We fight our way up through the Kuva Fortress to the Queens, where it is revealed that Teshin was actually working for the Queens all along. Teshin manages to incapacitate our Warframe, and the Queen burrows into the forehead of the Warframe with the Kuva staff. The Kuva itself reaches through the transference back to the Tenno, but luckily, Ordis, our orbiter claptrap, cuts off the link at the last moment and plays some calming music. However, after discovering that we can no longer use our void powers and thusly is no longer the operator of the Warframes, he purges us from the orbiter and leaves us on the snow-covered mountain peaks on Earth. Now, if you thought the situation after waking up for the first time was dire, we are now on Earth without our Warframes, without our void powers, or without our orbiter in unhospitable weather, which will undoubtedly kill us if we don't find weather soon. Luckily, we do stumble upon a cave almost immediately, which I have to say is very fortunate, convenient even. As a matter of fact, it is a little bit too good to be true because Teshin is already here. He misses us, and in the process he conveniently manages to also close the door between us. We then continue to stumble through the cave, and eventually we fall into a hole and get a bone stuck in our leg, after which we are incredibly actually able to move faster than we were before. We make our way through the underside of the cave system while avoiding the creature hunting us and remembering how to use our void powers in a more proficient way than before. And at the same time, we also seem to remember our time on the Saruman, which is a massive spaceship made in the Orokin era. The Saruman got stuck in the void, and this is where all Tenno got their powers from. I mean, specifically, I think they got it from the man in the wall. Spoilers, but don't worry, we will get there in a moment anyways. Okay, but anyways, eventually after going through this self-discovery journey, we make it to a mirror at the bottom of the cave, and in this mirror, we at first see our own reflection, but then all of a sudden we see the queen looking back at us, and so it turns out that everything that happened after Ordis cut off the transference actually was happening within our own mind, while the queen was trying to eliminate our sense of being so that she could take over our body. With our increased understanding of who we are as a person, yes, it's kind of corny, we are able to resist the effect of the queen and eventually wake up back in the orbiter, except this time it's actually happening. However, the somatic chair has been heavily damaged by the queens while trying to break into our mind. Fortunately, apparently, we don't need it anymore because for some reason, we are now able to transfer directly into our Warframe and even bring our real bodies to wherever the Warframe is at. I have to say, this doesn't really make any sense, but okay, because it inherently makes the stakes higher if we cannot always just hide behind our Warframe and never actually show up to any of the dangerous situations, while always having more Warframes at hand. That kind of eliminates any potential tension. So I think this was a much needed change. But anywho, we use our new Void technique to defeat the queens and take the Void Scepter from her, which means that she loses control over Teshin, meaning that we can now let Teshin kill her, or we can kill her ourselves, or we could just let her rot away. In any case, the queen eventually dies and we escape the Kuva fortress with Teshin. I think that most people agree that the War Within is the best quest in the game. I think not even considering the greater narrative, the contained story is great just in of itself, and it also does a lot to expand on some of the main characters, such as Teshin, the Tenno themselves, and arguably the Lotus as well. It also explores a lot of interesting ideas within the Warframe world, such as Kuva and transference. Not to mention that it gives us the focus schools, which is one of the most impactful systems in the game. I said one off. Well, again, it's not perfect. Apparently the entire dream section happened within 5 seconds, but also the queens were able to control what happened within this very lengthy dream to a very specific degree. We just kind of have to assume that their perception was moving more slowly as well. And also, how exactly did Teshin get in there and help us? That didn't seem to make too much sense either. I would also like to mention that the War Within is actually guilty of committing not one, but two of the cardinal sins of storytelling within video games. The first one is a lengthy section of slow walking, and the other one is not necessarily video game specific, but it's the "it was all a dream." First up, the section of slow walking. This needs to happen. I feel like it makes sense because, and you can call me naive, but when first playing through the quest, I had no idea how we were going to get ourselves out of this situation. There's no point in setting up the scenario in which the player is completely helpless if you don't allow them to actually feel helpless, at least for a little while, and leaving us out in the blizzard is a really good way of doing that. All in all, I think this quest is immaculate. I played through it again for this broadcast, and you know what? It still managed to have an emotional impact on me, and granted it was a very small one this time around, but it's still honestly astounding that it managed to do it at all. That is no easy feat. Moving on to the sacrifice, and don't worry, we are almost at the new war. I just need to cover this one quest and then handle a little bit of background information. And then we can talk about the disaster that was the War Within. No, sorry, the new war. Sorry. First up, I'm just gonna say that the sacrifice just simply does not manage to have the same impact as the War Within. And I also don't think that it's quite on the same level. but those shoes were almost impossible to fill. And even then, I feel like it's an awesome quest. The sacrifice comes with an introductory cinematic called the Apostasy Prologue. In this cutscene, we have traveled to the chamber in which the Lotus has been residing up until this point, but we're not really there. We're just watching something which has already happened. A new and very important character named Ballas shows up and unleashes the Lotus from her capsule and disconnects all the wires connected to her helmet and thusly separates her from the network connected to the Tenno. The Lotus leaves with Ballas, leaving behind a confused Tenno holding her helmet in their arms. The quest likewise starts with a cinematic in which we see a Warframe called Umbra fight off a bunch of sentinels with relative ease. However, when faced with Ballas, he's paralyzed, and Ballas then calls upon a mysterious sentinel which is only shown from the side. This mysterious sentinel then kills Umbra. Now, skipping ahead a little bit, we come in possession of Umbra's blueprint, and being the gluttonous monsters that we are, enough is never enough. We of course decide to craft this Warframe. But to no one's surprise, Umbra is no ordinary Warframe and he actually starts attacking us. Upon doing so, we come into contact with him and we are able to see into his memories. We see that Umbra was one of the Dax, the warriors who served the Orokin, and I forgot to mention that Teshin was Dax and that Ballas is an Orokin. In his memory, Umbra is either strapped down or otherwise unable to move, with Ballas on one side and his son on the other. Now apparently the infestation has taken his voice, rendering him unable to speak, but by the way Ballas talks about it, it makes it sound as though it was actually he's doing instead. The point of view is of Umbra, and being strapped down to the bed while having the person that's about to kill you right next to you is generally unsettling. Now, there's no point in talking about this quest in a chronological order because what happens is that every time we have to solve a small puzzle and then hunt down Umbra, which will unlock another bit of his memory while also giving us another entry into Ballas' notebook. So let me just cover what we learned from Ballas' notes first. I'm going to give you the lore because a lot of what's in these notes are exactly lore. I'm gonna be explaining it in layman's terms, meaning that I will be skipping over some stuff and I will be oversimplifying some stuff as well, just so that you know. So we can actually get to the things this broadcast is actually about. We have the Orokin, who was basically the golden era of humanity. But while these arrogant people might have been wearing golden threads upon their bodies, their insides were rotten. They created the Sentinels to seek out a new world, as they had all but used up the resources of the Origin system. When the Sentinels turned on them, they created the Tenno to fight the Sentinels. Unfortunately for them, the Tenno would also turn on them, and it was this combined pressure that eventually managed to take down the Orokin. And yes, I am oversimplifying. Don't worry about it. What we learn from reading the notes is that Ballas had more to do with this than we initially thought. It turns out that he was in fact working with Hun Hao. In the Apostasy Prologue, we also learn about Margulis, who took care of the Tenno after the Saruman incident. For refusing to obey the orders of the council, Margulis is executed. Margulis is executed, and it is heavily implied that Ballas to some extent allowed this to happen to save face. In other words, his prestige and his status within the realm of the Orokin was more important to him than saving someone he supposedly was very close to, or whom he might even have loved. He would then go on to regret this for the rest of his life, and this is in many ways the catalyst for all his future actions. But back to Umbra. Ballas uses some kind of telekinesis to talk to Umbra and explain the process of creating Warframes. Apparently, it includes someone being infected with the infestation, which is a semi-sentient hive mind creature, and then imbuing that person with a single memory which they have to relive over and over again forever. This memory for Umbra is killing his own son. Finally, we hunt down Umbra one final time without our Warframe, and enter his memories. We tell him that it's not his fault, that he was being controlled by Ballas and that he is as much a victim as his son. Having been on the Saruman and experienced the horrors of the void, we are able to share in Umbra's pain and calm him down. Afterwards, he becomes one of our Warframes, but still while maintaining his own free will. Now we go and hunt down Ballas, where we first saw him fight Umbra. We defeat all of his sentient fighters with ease and attempt to kill him, but once again Umbra is not able to attack him because he is an Orokin. But as you will remember, we now have the ability to transport ourselves to where our Warframe is at. Doing so, we help Umbra push in the sword and injure Ballas gravely. Before we can deal the final blow, however, the sentinel Ballas used in the beginning to kill Umbra shows up, and it turns out that it was the Lotus all along. But not only that, this sentient form is her true form, and the Lotus was just a split personality of hers. Now moving on to the rest, and I'm not kidding, I have this script in sections like the sacrifice, the war within, and so on, but this section is just called The Bad. But before we get there, I'll go ahead and mention the things that I did like. The visuals are stunning all the way through. Sure, some of the animations are a little stunted, especially some of the facial expressions don't necessarily always land. But with that being said, every time you look out a window into one of these space battles, it's a visual feast. I think especially the surroundings in the last fight at the end of the quest, not to spoil it yet, but it's extremely pretty to look at. I also like the way that Ballas is defeated in the end. It doesn't necessarily feel like an ass pull. And I think one of my favorite moments in fiction is whenever the Void or the Man in the Wall, or whatever you want to call it, reaches out his hand and says, "Thanks, kiddo, I think I will." Again, not to spoil it, but just so that you know that I do appreciate it. The visuals and the gameplay, in terms of that, there's nothing wrong with the new war. My only problem is with the story of this narratively driven main story quest. Also, just really quick, the only reason why I haven't really mentioned Chains of Harrow yet is because, well, nothing happens. It's mostly a self-contained story. The only thing that really carries over is the concept of the Man in the Wall, but not really, because we are kind of introduced to that anyways in the new war. It's just that the name itself, the Man in the Wall, is first mentioned in Chains of Harrow. I really actually seriously do not want to talk about the Heart of Deimos, but if I want to make my point, then I have to do it. We don't have to talk about the story itself, the family conflict. It really doesn't have anything to do with the main story, but what is incredibly important is the heart itself. We're not talking about a metaphorical heart. No. There is a literal mechanical heart within the caves just below the surface of the moon beside Mars, which actually beats like a real heart, and if the heart ever stops beating, then the tenor will lose all of their powers forever. Sick. And, I mean, first off, this is obviously really fucking stupid. This doesn't need to happen. The conflict of the quest, Deimos' heart itself, it doesn't need this to function. There's no reason to retcon it. But also, this creates a massive narrative problem, because this means that if anyone ever learns about this heart, which, doesn't like the Tenno, so basically everyone in the Origin system, well, then they can just destroy this one chamber on this one moon just below the surface, and then the Tenno will be no more. And again, we gain our powers within the Void, from the Man in the Wall, and obviously those powers are derived from the Void itself in some way. What does this one random heart on Deimos have to do with anything? Well, apparently it has something to do with everything, because it seems to be our sole source of power. Not the Lotus, not the Infestation, not even Lua, or I don't know, the Void itself. No, just this one heart on Deimos. Fucking great. That's just brilliant. Just one more thing before we can get into the new war, because we still have the Chimera Prologue, Era, and the Maker. All of these are just part of one cinematic quest, which sort of acts like, well, it's called the Prelude to War, and that is exactly what it is. Let me just summarize the most important information. First, we see Ballas, who has been turned into some kind of weird hybrid between an Orokin and a Sentinel. He seemingly also has been turned into a slave for the Sentinels, but he secretly helps us craft a sword called the Paracesis, the ultimate sentient slayer. Then next we see far into the past. We see the old war in which the sentients attack Lua. And this is where we are introduced to the greatest character ever. A sentient named Era. This is of course a joke, but anyways, he calls the Lotus sister, and I'm just gonna go ahead and spoil it. Their father, it turns out, is Hunhao. Why do these creatures replicating from one mass of some radiant red matter have family-like relations to one another? I don't know. It's not massively important, I just wanted to mention it. We then return to present day, where Era has Ballas on a leash. He talks to the Lotus about building something, which we later learn is a massive fleet of Murexes, which are essentially giant motherships of the sentient. I should also mention that the Lotus killed Era on Lua during the old war. Not as in she thought that she killed him, but as in she did actually kill him. But he's also very much alive and talking to her right now. Era wants the Lotus, who at this point calls herself Natan, to give it a spark. But Natan suddenly remembers that he killed him and starts bringing his intentions into question. So he basically grabs her and throws her against the wall, which then starts to siphon her powers. Just to recap chronologically before we get into the new war itself, Ballas betrays the Orokin and works with Hunhao. Then the sentients attack Lua and the Lotus kills Era. Ballas then allies himself fully with the sentient, and afterward he goes and frees the Lotus from her capsule, which she was apparently already capable of leaving all along, but let's just try and ignore that and just accept the retcon. He then transforms her into a sentient, or maybe transforms her back into a sentient. We don't really know if she always was or was not, that's not really clear. Then he pretends to be a slave of the sentient and helps us craft the legendary Sentient Slayer after having transformed himself into a sentient. Then he continues to pretend to be a slave of the sentient, trying to get Natan to do something which we don't know what that is yet. She starts to remember and refuse to do so, so Era, who is currently working for Ballas, grabs Natan and effortlessly throws her against the wall, forcing her to do the thing they're trying to fool her into doing anyways. And if you feel like this is suddenly a giant mess, you have another thing coming. As much as I simply want to get started, I have to preemptively call attention to something because I know that if I don't, then the comment section absolutely will. During the Ropalolis assassination, Natan suddenly starts talking to you. She says some gibberish. My father was a carpenter, and then something, whatever, doesn't matter. If you take the first letter of each word, or something like that, it comes out to, Tenno, I'm dying, please save me. But you would never know that if you did not look it up online, so it doesn't exist. And finally, we are here at the new war. Now, first section of the quest is actually great. Getting to play as Carl and Viso is a great idea, allowing us to see how each of the different factions fight back against the sentient attack really helps sell the idea that they would be able to overpower the entire system and take it with ease. As a matter of fact, the very first thing we see is one of the Murexes plow through the Unum Tower. Now this tower is powerful. It is powerful enough to keep the entire Grineer away from the Ostrons for at least multiple generations. It's insane. And the sentient takes it out as though it was nothing. Both of the stories connected to these side characters are also very emotional. Carl almost kills himself trying to save his brothers, of course talking about his fellow Grineer soldiers, and Viso actually kills himself and finally rejects capitalism, which is the whole point of the Corpus faction as a last act of heroism. But as soon as we start playing as a Tenno, this is where we take the aforementioned Swarn dive directly into hell. I'm talking about the quality of the storytelling here. The first problem is that the session where we have to play as Tishin is way too long. Now you might say that that doesn't have anything to do with the story itself, but it does, because all of the momentum which the previous sections have just established is completely lost as we keep playing this very slow and much less involved section of the story. And then we get to the infamous moment. So, Tessin goes ahead of us and disables the field, preventing us from using our Warframes on the Murex. He then gets into a fight with Era while wearing a veil. Now, veils are contraptions worn over the eyes of a person, which causes them to experience something that's not really happening, and which often will cause them to experience a euphoric existence, meaning that they wouldn't want to remove the veil. Though, it is also possible to make that person experience a terrible memory, which is the case here. Having to experience this bad memory causes Teshin to become weakened for like 10 minutes while fighting. Afterwards, he just reaches up and pulls it off with what seems like relative ease. At this point, he then collapses to his knees and Era crosses his helmet. This actually kills him, but it is done in such an unceremonious way that me and a lot of other players did not realize that he had been killed until we went ahead and paid him a visit in one of the relays where he has been turned into a hologram. So yeah, they killed off one of the most realized characters in such a lame way that most players didn't realize that it had happened, in spite of the fact that it happened right in front of them. That is astounding. And you know what? It gets so much worse from here, because we then see Ballas kiss the Lotus and siphon some kind of power from her into himself. He then opens a portal into the void and the Lotus starts getting sucked into the portal. We immediately rush over and catch her hand with our Warframe, but she slips out of our grasp. But we transfer out of our Warframe, catches the Warframe's hand and then grabs the Lotus, again preventing her from being pulled into the void. She tells us to let her go, but we refuse and actually start to pull her back a little bit. But then Ballas shows up with the paracesis and cuts off the Lotus hand, which then of course causes her to get sucked into the void. And you know what we do? Absolutely nothing. We just fall on our knees and just watches as he's sucked into the void. As a matter of fact, we continue to just sit on our knees and stare into the portal while Ballas very slowly and casually walks up behind us and spears us through the chest with the sentient killer, which for some reason have the ability to kill us even though we have sustained much worse injuries before. And then the main character dies and is sucked into the void. It sounds like I'm making this shit up, but I promise you this is actually what happens. I don't even know where to begin. The whole reason why he wanted the Lotus was because she reminded him of Margulis. But then he turns into this sentient creature which looks nothing like her. And then apparently the only thing he ever needed from her, he could just have siphoned from her body at any point. So why any of this? And also, how does Ballas have the paracesis? Now, I've heard two attempts at explaining this away, but I think they're both copium, or rather utterly insane. The first one is that there is actually two paracesis, and I don't know, there doesn't seem to be anything, at least in the main quest, that indicate this. No voice line, we never see two paracesis at the same time unless we do, and then I'm just stupid, I guess. Doesn't really matter. In either case, let's just assume that there are two paracesis, even though that's a lot of mental gymnastics. Okay, whatever. And Ballas already had one of them. And then the reason why he allowed us to craft the other one, or rather showed us how to do it, is because he wanted to pin us and the Lotus against one another, and then have us kill the Lotus with the paracesis. But this doesn't make sense because obviously he was able to physically overpower her and force her to do whatever he wanted, and then take whatever powers he wanted from her as well, and just add it to himself. And even if we did use it to kill the Lotus, then there's no reason why we wouldn't come after him next. So in either case, he obviously wouldn't want us to have the ultimate sentient killer, considering that he turned himself into a sentient and that his entire army is made out of sentience. The other possible explanation is that Ballas knew that he needed the paracesis in order to kill the Tenno, so he then crafted it, or rather, he allowed us to craft it, whatever. Now, it turned out that it worked out for him in the end, but it's kind of insane that he would assume that we would just show up, throw the sword on the ground, and then throw ourselves on our knees and just wait for him to walk over, pick up the blade, slowly walk over to us, and then kill us with it. That is absurd. It turns out that I have to correct myself because when we return as the operator later in the story, Order says that he has gone ahead and rebuilt the paracesis for us, which means that the paracesis that Ballas used to kill us was in fact our original paracesis. unless there is now 3 parestheses, I guess. But whatever, I am tired of running in circles. Can we just agree that it's really dumb that the main character, the main Tenno, just sits there and let Ballast kill them? I mean, for God's sake, we just watched him kill our mentor, Teshin, who risked his life for us several times. And the Lotus as well. We just watched him kill the Lotus. And our reaction is not to get mad, to get back into our Warframe and try to kill him. It is to fall over and let him kill us. Okay, great, yeah, terrific character writing. Anyways, let's actually move on. It has now been long enough for the Sentients to take over the Origin system almost entirely. We are then introduced to a character whose entire face is covered by several rags. They look suspiciously like the Operator, but a little bit too tall. They are on a mission to free some prisoners, and from the way they talk about it, it sounds as though they've done this several times. And keep in mind, it has been long enough for the Sentient to fully take over the Origin system. Anyways, while down there attempting to free one of the prisoners, one of the Archons show up. This new character manages to barely escape, and it then turns out that the person they've been talking to this time is Ordis. And it also turns out that this mysterious figure is actually the Operator. Except it's not, it's the Operator, but from a different future. I mean, like from a different timeline, maybe. They call themselves the Drifter, or, I guess Nora calls them the Drifter, whatever. And they somehow have the remains of the Lotus in the back of the Orbiter. And for some reason, they just now decide to try and do something to save her. The way they plan on doing this is to first break into one of the Veil factories, which requires them to put on one of the Veils. This floods their minds with painful memories. Maybe. The reason why I say maybe is because these cannot be memories, because in these dreams, or whatever you want to call them, the Lotus says that Ballast no longer had time for her because all of his love went into the Tenno. But then we fight Ballast at the end of the quest, and he says that the Lotus no longer have time or love left for him because he poured all of it into the Tenno. Fuck. I mean, I get you want to be mysterious, but it just doesn't make sense. Now, Ballast is not exactly known for telling the truth, so we can just assume that it's the Lotus version that is the correct version, but then why is the Veil showing us this painful memory that never happened? How does the Veil work again? Anyways, we don't have time for that because then the Drifter goes ahead and pays Hon Hao and Shadow a visit. The Drifter then talk no jutsu Hon Hao into helping her, and he gives her the Nataruk and tells her to go and hunt Archons. I just want to remind you that this is the same guy which helped Ballast, who worked with Ballast to overthrow the Oricon. And now he's turning on Ballast and the Sentients. I mean, not really, like he's trying to help them from themselves or whatever, it doesn't matter. But okay, regardless, he sends the Drifter off to kill the Archons with little faith that they will actually be able to do it. But unsurprisingly, the Drifter manages to kill one of the Archons with only a little bit of help from Shadow. They then retrieve the Archon shard, and this kills the Archon in the process. This magical shard is then given to the Lotus, and she does this Five Nights of Freddy's-like jump scare, and it is pointless. It does not develop the characters, it does not move the plot forward, it does not help to create a moment, it does not fit thematically. I mean, you don't win when your audience goes, huh? Why did that happen? Or when they cringe out of their skin. But back to the Drifter. She's off, or they are off, whatever, and they kill another Archon and brings back the shard and give it to the Lotus, who then goes berserk. She then turns completely sentient and starts mindlessly attacking the Drifter. Now, something else has been happening in this story that I have been skipping over because it all takes place in the past. But in the quest itself, it jumps back and forth between past and present, which is kind of clever considering the theme of the quest. It's just executed on horribly, but don't worry, we'll get there. In this first flashback, we see how the Operator got stuck on the Saruman, or rather I should say how the Saruman got stuck in the Void. Something went wrong while they did a hyper jump, which once again caused them to get stuck in the Void. But right before this happened, we see the operator who is currently in class learning about eternalism. The main principle of eternalism is that the past and future is just as real as the present. Just hold on to that thought for a moment. The void then, for some reason, affect the mind of the adults on board, turning them utterly insane. And again, for some reason, this does not affect the children, so they just hide away in the classroom. Our Tenno, who, as you will remember, is dead in the present, walks around the classroom and talks to each of the other students, and suddenly some of the adults starts trying to break into the classroom. Our Tenno walks over to one of the other students and says, "Hey, have you lost your light? Here, take mine." The classmate then turns around and they have our face. They say in a demonic, reverberating voice, "Thanks, kiddo. I think I will." They then continue, "I can save them, but you have to want it." We catch back up to the present, where the Drifter is trying to fight off the Lotus, but he's much too powerful for them, so they end up laying down their weapons and putting up their hands. But the Lotus decide to attack them regardless, but Ordis throws himself in front of the energy beam, catching it and dying in the process. The Lotus then goes to kill the Drifter, and we cut back to the past again. Okay. Back to the operator, who shakes the hand of the Void Demon, which is where they get their void powers. And then the most insane shit happens. The second we see them take the Void Demon's hand, all other versions of themselves die, and the camera then pans around and we see the operator and the Drifter shaking each other's hand. We snap back to the present, where instead of the Drifter, it is now the operator standing in front of the Lotus, and with their void powers they are able to fight her off. And then the Lotus suddenly remembers who they are and then flies off to go and kill Ballas on their own. I don't have the strength to talk about the character assassination of the Lotus, so let's just focus on the timey-wimey nonsense. There is just so much wrong with this. I'm just gonna start somewhere and eventually maybe we'll actually get through all of it. But first I have to establish that eternalism is exactly the same as multiverse theory. I've heard a lot of people say that it's not, because eternalism only applies to time, and that might be true if there was no way for a person in the present to interact with something in the past or in the future. But we know that's not true from this interaction, because the operator making a deal with the Void Demon, which they've already made in the past, allows them to switch places with a version of themselves from a different timeline in the present. And yeah, you heard that correct. Different version of themselves, which means that there were two versions of them doing two different things at the same moment in time, meaning that there have to be multiple different realities with their own timelines, meaning that there are potentially an endless amount of possible universes, meaning that it is exactly the same as multiverse theory, at least for this purpose. But anyways, I guess my first question would be, how did the Drifter even make it to our timeline, even if we accept that the same person can just switch places with another version of themselves in that timeline at any point, which is already ridiculous? This still doesn't make sense. Remember, Ballas killed our current version of the operator in this timeline in the beginning of this quest, meaning that this timeline doesn't have a Tenno. So it shouldn't be possible for any version of the Tenno anywhere to interact with this timeline anymore, because they don't exist here any longer. Even their body doesn't exist. It was sucked back into the void. Then there's also the fact that the operator and the Drifter essentially destroys all other versions of themselves when the operator accepts the void powers. This is either impossible or pointless. I'm gonna go with pointless, because I think that train of thought is more interesting to explore. But just really quick, the reason why it's impossible is because if there exists an endless number of Tenno which can do anything at any time, what would happen is that two or more of them would accept the void powers at the same time. Actually, an infinite amount of them would accept the void powers at the same moment in time. And then they would kill each other and cancel out, which means that none of them could exist ever. But let's go with pointless, because again, I think that's more fun. Let's say that they do actually destroy every other version of themselves in this moment. We know for a fact that the past can affect the present, and whenever they do this, they create a new timeline. since any version of the past can exist equally with the present according to eternalism, at any point the past can interact with the present, which means that it is also interacting with the present at all times in all possible ways, which means that it is creating all possibilities at all times, meaning that we are instantaneously brought back to a reality where all possibilities exist the very second that we destroy them. I hope that your head is hurting, because mine sure is. And then there's also the question of why did the operator accepting the powers of the void creature create a link between them and the drifter? If the drifter is just some random version of themselves, which was never saved from the Saruman, then why were they linked, and why that person specifically? I'm sure there were several versions of themselves which wasn't rescued from the Saruman. Now, the only explanation that I could really think of was that these two versions of themselves were already preordained to cross paths again, which is in the future, which is exactly what happens in the New War. But that's also impossible because we already established that it is possible for everything to happen, which means that every possibility exists, meaning that an endless number of outcomes would eventually collide with one another and be exactly the same, meaning that there should be an endless number of operators and drifters in any one timeline. See, that's a problem with infinity. It is possible to have multiple infinities exist within that original infinity simply by that original infinity existing in the first place. The way that you have to think about this is that it's represented by a line, and this line represents time. Any instance or anything anywhere on this line can interact with that same thing anywhere else on this line, and when they do so, they change the direction of the line, but it doesn't erase the original line or stop that line from moving forward. The future is just as real as the present and the past, so the line always exists infinitely in any direction anyways. But now you essentially have two lines, and since they originate from that same point, that means that they are touching each other, so anything that happens on this new line can interact with everything on the old line. And whenever they do so, they create a third line that will also be connected to the network. Anything that happens on this third line can interact with anything in the entire network, right? And maybe you can see the problem. Now, I won't go on and on about this. I think you get the point. Multiverse stories are almost never good, and I'll get into why in a second, but the simple answer is that it's really, really difficult to write these kind of stories. I've written a 700-page fantasy and, it didn't turn out as well as I wanted it to. But I can tell you, writing in general, especially on these larger pieces, is hard. It's really difficult. But you're not doing yourself any favors by taking on this kind of story, which requires an expert level of writing skill already. As you have probably noticed, there are just a lot more things that you have to take into account when writing a multiverse story. I think most people will agree that the MCU have accomplished some astonishing things in storytelling, but how long did it take them from starting to take multiverse serious in their own universe for them to go to the fucking memory store in Multiverse of Madness? It is my belief as a writer that if you conflict yourself with some constrictions, such as when people die, they are dead and you can therefore no longer use them in your story, that tends to create more interesting narratives because it forces you to be creative. Now, while Multiverse opens up a lot of possibilities, it also makes it really fucking easy to always go with the easy option. And it can often feel like things just happens. Which is always true because things happen because the author says that it happens. I think most people understand that on an intellectual level, but it shouldn't feel that way. And just to give you a clear example, in this one quest alone, they killed Ordis, they killed the Lotus, they kind of killed the main character as well. And if they decide to bring back Tessian, which I absolutely think that they will, that is 4 fake out deaths in one quest. Fake out deaths have 0 emotional impact and they negatively affect the rest of the story because you are telling the audience that death means nothing in this universe. Yeah, sure, we defeated Ballas at the end of this quest, But that doesn't mean anything, because there must exist a different version of him somewhere which could just magically snap into existence. And now you might say that, well, that's not possible, because there needs to be an instance of him in this timeline already for that to happen. But if that was true, then that would mean that there would already have had to have been a version of the Operator or the Drifter in this current timeline for any of them to be able to come back, but there just fucking wasn't one. The other argument is that, well, he doesn't have void powers, but since every possibility exists, at some point our Operator or Drifter would create a timeline where he does get void powers, and then from there he would create an infinite amount of timelines of himself with void powers, coincidentally, which is another infinity within an infinity within another infinity. DE has obviously proven that they know how to write good stories, but I don't have faith that they are proficient enough to write a multiverse story. I mean, I know that I'm not good enough. Again, I think they're good at writing stories, but they're not necessarily a genius. As a matter of fact, I think with the 4 fake out deaths within this one quest, I want to say that they've already proven that they don't have the restraint to make something like this work. But I mean, don't ask question. Just consume product and then get excited for next product, right? Okay, shall we complete the rest of this quest? Yeah? Just to remind you where we were at before all of this multiverse talk. The Lotus has gone off to kill Ballas on her own, and now you get to choose whether you want to play the rest of the quest as the Drifter or as the Operator. I'm just gonna assume that you pick the Operator, but don't worry, it's not gonna make much of a splash. And I'm also going to skip ahead a little bit because not that much happens. We fight our way up through the Unum Tower, then we fight our way through some Murexes, then we use our rail deck and fight through some more Murexes, and on the way we also kill the last Archon and take its shard. It is now that we find out that Ballas' master plan is to consume the sun with his great Devourer spaceship. Fuck. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but let me just do this. How much of the solar system's mass do you think is in the sun? It's 99.8%. That's the vast majority. And if we assume that the moon of Mars is the same size as the moon of Earth, that means that's 0.00004% of the total mass in the solar system, which is in Deimos. And if we just assume that it would take Ballas 8 hours to consume the entirety of the sun, this would mean that consuming Deimos would take only 11 microseconds, aka 0.1 seconds. And that is assuming that he decides to consume the entire moon, let alone the tiny chamber that the heart is in, which, at which point the tenor would be rendered completely helpless. But let's try and ignore how silly it actually is that he's consuming the entire sun. I know, like, Warframe is about power fantasy. They keep saying that. It doesn't mean anything. But also, like, he's consuming the entire sun. I mean, this is some Dragon Ball nonsense. Okay, anyways. We make our way to the top of the Devourer at the same time as the Lotus. And we have the final Archon shard for her, which he will need in order to recover. But Ballas manages to steal it from us and use it on himself. This makes him so powerful that he's able to use it to take control over the Lotus and make her fight us in his stead. We are eventually defeated, but the Lotus promises to be whatever he wants it to be if he lets us live. Ballas gets so excited about this that he apparently forgets that the Operator exists, allowing them to run up behind him and put a veil on him. This causes him to see the Lotus as Margolis. She then asks him to kiss her, and as he does so, she steals all of his power and killing him in the process while returning herself to her former version of herself as the Lotus, but it's like an exalted or awakened version of herself. I forgot to mention that the reason why Ballas even wanted to eat the sun in the first place was because he needs a lot of energy in order to travel to the homeworld of the sentients, known as Tau. Just as he is defeated, the portal opens. The Lotus then protects us while trying to close the portal. And as this happens, the man in the wall, literally, and I mean literally, a giant man inside a wall comes spiraling out of the portal and steals the energy of the Lotus. Apparently, she's not hurt by this. I guess now she doesn't need the energy anymore. But yeah, anyways, the portal is closed and everyone goes home. I can't wait for the Veri to explain all of this, and I didn't even talk about how pretty much every single last character was assassinated in this quest. And I don't mean that they were killed, I mean that their personality was completely butchered. I also didn't talk about Era. I mean, I don't know what to say. I think it's kind of silly that Hunhao is like, oh, you're just serving the Oracle now. You're just working for Ballas. That's so bad. How can you work for Ballas? How could someone ever do that? Except that's exactly what I did. And then Era like gets crossed under a bunch of debris and it's never fucking explained. But I guess it doesn't matter because you just bring him back to life. And why even like bother having a moment where they reconcile? You could just have them transform magically into versions of themselves that has already reconciled, so we don't have to spend time on it, because literally anything can happen at any time and nothing matters anymore. Jesus, why would you do this? Like nothing in the story can have meaning now. How are you supposed to ever get invested in anything? Okay, whatever, fuck it. Anyways, I think that was everything I wanted to talk about. Don't forget to tune in to the next broadcast, I guess, which hopefully will be less angry. If you made it all the way to the end, maybe subscribe, comment, YouTube algorithm, do now. You got to do. Okay, goodbye.